Hi everyone, thanks for joining us on this early morning. We are very appreciative of you being here. I'm Jen Bachner. I direct the Master of Science in Government Analytics program here at Johns Hopkins, as well as the Certificate in Government Analytics. We've been running this forum for several years now, and the purpose is to establish a community of people in government, industry, and academia to discuss how analytics are used in the public sector. And we very much encourage this to be a discussion. So I think you are welcome to ask questions throughout the presentation, to offer your insights, and the presenters might even ask questions of you. And you're also welcome to tweet about the forum on Twitter using the hashtag GAB forum, and there will be a recording of the presentation that will be posted about 48 hours after the event if you'd like to review it or share it with your colleagues. So once again, thank you for coming, and I will turn the program over to my colleague at REI Systems to introduce our speakers.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Jeff Myers. I'm with REI Systems. I want to mention a couple of things. First, as Jen says, the purpose of this event is to try and strengthen community. So you have someone to turn to when you have a problem who's perhaps been through the problem before and has some ideas. I also want to mention that REI Systems, Johns Hopkins University, as well as ACT-IAC, the American Council for Technology Industry Advisory Councils, are right as we speak undertaking a survey of analytics. And I hope that you all will respond to it. If you haven't, I'll be happy, and we will push out the information with a link to respond to the survey to everyone who's registered for this event. And the purpose of that survey, frankly, is to be able to gather from across the community answers to some very basic questions, such as what kinds of analytic models are people using? What types of skills are they looking for when they seek for employees who have expertise or will undertake analytic roles? What kinds of tools are they using? What kinds of value is being obtained from analytics? Is it helping you defend a budget, or is it helping you on a tactical day-to-day decision-making basis, or kind of in setting long-term strategy? And again, you may be very familiar with that, of course, on your own behalf, but as we've looked over the last several years, we haven't been able to find a good picture across the community that helps answer those questions. We think that picture, which we'll share in a presentation like this in September, will be very valuable to folks across the government analytics community to be able to make decisions and hopefully help defend the use of evidence and data in making those decisions to improve government and public services for people, no matter what agency you're part of or what program you work with. So that's a plug for the analytics survey. Let me give you a very brief background about REI, and then I'll introduce our speakers. REI Systems works with a wide range of federal, primarily civilian grant-making clients, although we've recently been asked to support analytics work at the Consumer Financial Protection Board and the Department of Defense. So we're kind of branching out a little bit. There are two things in particular we've done lately that I think might be interesting. One is we focus a lot on agencies that make grants, and so we've come up with a grants diagnostic, kind of the first standard set of performance measures in terms of making grants, so that you can then say, if I've taken this diagnostic, where do I fit? In terms of how timely I respond to grant applications, am I in the top 20th percentile or the bottom 20th percentile? So it allows people to be able to use analytics in a way that, again, gives kind of a context of how do I look within comparison to other agencies that are doing similar activities. So that's one topic. And a similar topic that's kind of related to that is that REI is working with the Office of Management Budget on helping make transparent the connection between grant program performance and grant spending. And so we'll be having a webinar with OMB and GSA on June 27th, in a week from today. And if any of you are interested in that, I can get you a free invitation to the free webinar so you can see that perspective as well. But with that aside, these events, if you aren't aware, we try and structure so that they kind of touch a range of different topics and a range of different agencies. So we previously had topics such as how do we deal with risk, from the Chief Risk Management Officer at the IRS and analytics around risk. We've had a panel that says how do we use analytics to combat the opioid crisis, and we've had a couple of folks who are the Chief Data Officer at HHS and Centers for Medicare and Medicaid talking about that. We've had a perspective of what does a senior political appointee look for when they want analytic products. So we had the Commissioner of the Public Building Service come in and talk a little bit about what a senior executive looks for. So we've got a variety of topics and a variety of agencies. We would love to have your input and your ideas about what sorts of topics would you like to hear about, what sorts of agencies would you like to hear from next, and even perhaps are there particular individuals that you would like to hear from that you think are doing great work. And it may need to go with saying, if you think you're doing something that is really important and would be interesting to members of the broader community, we would love to have one of you volunteer to be a speaker at an upcoming panel. And so with that in mind, let me introduce to you Andrew Nicklin and Miriam McKinney, who are leaders in the Center for Government Excellence at Johns Hopkins University and have been doing research with respect to artificial intelligence, and not just use of the analytic tool, but kind of what we think of these days maybe as bumper guards or as kind of guardrails to help make sure that as we use new and advanced analytic techniques that maybe the world at large doesn't necessarily understand, are there risks with the use of those techniques, and how is it in particular that perhaps we ought to think about ways to address some of those potential risks, in particular in this case with artificial intelligence. So let me ask Miriam to kick it off. They've also described, though, that they are willing to have your questions at any point. And so we would encourage you to ask questions. These are always much more interesting events if there's a little bit of discussion back and forth. And beware, I've invited them to ask you questions too.
Thank you. Hey everyone. So we're really excited to be here with you guys today. We just want to say thank you first to Jen Bachner for inviting us to speak with you all today. And also Jeff Myers, thank you for putting this together, and everyone at REM Systems. Before we start chatting with you guys, we just want to establish a couple of things. So, like Jeff said, we're going to be having a conversation. I just want to remind everyone to be respectful of your peers and of their comments and their questions. And the second is that if you're speaking from experience, it would be helpful that you share this. So please be explicit and let us know. So before we start, how many of you are students or work in academia? Okay, a lot of you. Do any of you work in the government? Okay. How many of you work with data? Oh, okay, great. And then how many of you have either studied, interpreted, or created an algorithm recently? Okay. Great. So many of you are going to be familiar with the topics that we talk about today, especially when we get into artificial intelligence itself. Even if you haven't studied artificial intelligence per se, this conversation is really hard to miss nowadays, especially in so many of our workplaces. So I just want to start out and say algorithms are mirrors, and they reflect the patterns that they recognize within our data. Just remember that. So with this in mind, a multidisciplinary team recently created a tool that deeply considers the potential implications and issues surrounding algorithms, and then provides tactical guidance and resources for mitigating these threats. This tool that we're talking about is called the Ethics and Algorithms Toolkit, and I was part of that team, so was Andrew. So we posed the following question: your algorithms are biased, what are you going to do about it? But before getting into that, I want to introduce myself a little bit more. Why am I here? My name is Miriam McKinney. I'm a data analyst at the Center for Government Excellence at Johns Hopkins University. Yes, that's a mouthful. Before joining GovX, I completed my master's coursework at Columbia University through the Quantitative Methods in the Social Sciences program. While there, I was a research assistant at a nonprofit called Change for Kids, and I was also a research assistant at the university's Institute for Social and Economic Research and Policy. It's also a mouthful. Even before that, in college, I was a psychology major. I studied things like social psychology, multicultural psychology, statistics, and more. So I've always been interested in research that promotes social good. And I learned in graduate school that data can be effective, and it also can be very powerful, and it can change lives. So that's why I work in this field. Very quickly, well, let me first introduce Andrew Nicklin. He's my colleague at now the Centers for Civic Impact. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that structure.
Sure. So GovX as an organization, the Center for Government Excellence, has existed for probably the past 4 years, and recently we did some restructuring and have sort of branched out, and we now have several different centers. So there's GovX, which is where Miriam is. There's GovX Academy, which is focused on technical training largely for municipal governments around the country. GovX, where Miriam is, focuses on technical assistance, so it's like on the ground. Consulting is not quite the right word for it, but sort of advisory work and support work for local governments. We also do work with states. And then we have something called the Applied Public Research Center, which looks at sort of work that's going on in the Hopkins community and other universities, and figures out how to translate that into application in the more local context of the public sector, because we think there's actually kind of a significant gap there between what happens in frankly the ivory towers and what's actually happening in government around the country. And then on top of those is this new entity called the Center for Civic Impact, which is where I work. And I have this really great opportunity to invent a title for myself, so I called myself the Futurist at Large. And the idea behind that is really to examine kind of the upcoming trends and patterns that are going to affect governments, now and in the future. And so obviously, the conversation around AI and ethics, and we're all hearing the debate now about facial recognition and what Facebook is doing to our political landscape. These are all really important questions, but there's also, for me, there's also the really tangible question of like, what can local governments, what can state governments do to start to manage these issues for the AI, for the algorithmic tools that they're implementing. And so I was really interested in working on this project, and so we did. And just to give you another sense of the kind of things that I do, I'm about to sort of publish a toolkit for blockchain, again, sort of oriented at local governments, but with the idea being that like, here's a set of, kind of parameters that you can think about for blockchain and the situations in which it might be useful and the situations in which it won't. And we're also going deep on some privacy things, because actually a lot of local governments in particular struggle with privacy, especially in the context of both their state regulatory landscape as well as the federal landscape. So it's a really interesting place to be. Anyway, so that's kind of a little brief thing about what I do. But anyway, let's focus on the toolkit and the ethics and algorithm stuff, because it's actually really exciting and interesting, and probably some of the, I feel like, the greatest work that I've done in like the last 10 years. So,
Awesome. Thank you. So now that we've given you the whole spiel about ourselves, does anyone want to share why they're passionate about working with data or data science?
I'm an HR director, and data is critical for us to understand where our successful candidates are coming from, so that we can continue to go to that source and bring more highly qualified candidates in.
Oh, where do you work?
GAO, Government Accountability Agency, yeah.
I'd actually like to say, it's interesting to think about grants, because it seems like a dry subject, but when you come right down to it, a lot of what the federal government does is raise money and then ask local governments to carry out the program because they're close to the people. And the connection between those is scant, because there's not a lot of money to pay feds to go out and watch and see the work being done. So the data coming back really is important, because that's really the only way the federal government knows whether or not its program is being implemented. And it's more than 20% of federal spending. It's more than $700 billion. So the data around grants is both hard to obtain and really important.
I'm interested in, I'm creating a new data analytics department for my program. And I just see how this program data analytics can not only drive this program, but it can drive the agency that I'm in. So that has just kind of captured my attention, so I'm thirsty for more.
Sorry, what agency are you at? Where are you?
USCIS.
Thank you. Awesome. So great, now that we've all become a little more comfortable with each other, I want to talk about some of the headlines that we've seen recently. I've seen a lot of these headlines, and they can be pretty scary, and we just want to have a conversation about this. So have any of you seen any of these headlines or something like this? Things like this? Okay. So what do you feel when you read these headlines? What are the feelings that come up for you guys?
Paranoia. Big brother.
when you say paranoia, do you mean other people are being paranoid, or do you get does it create paranoia in you?
It creates paranoia.
Yeah.
People out to get me.
Yeah.
I'm not in control of what I think is the space around me.
Gotcha. So similar to the Big Brother.
Good. Awesome. Well, one of the headlines in particular, this one we're going to talk a little bit about. So it's actually a news article based on something called the Compass algorithm. It was an algorithm made by Northpoint, which it renamed and is now Equivant. So this algorithm basically was something, or is something that's used by people working in the judicial system to decide whether an incarcerated person should be given bail or should be kept in the prison system. So the problem with this algorithm was that it completely overpredicts for African American incarcerated persons, where it underpredicts for white incarcerated persons. In this situation specifically, bias and predictive accuracy are critical concepts to understand because we're talking about people's lives. and how they're directly affected by prison sentences. So, does anyone have any idea why this algorithm might have turned out this way? Why it overpredicts for some, underpredicts for others?
The data source and the population that is in there. I mean, if you're pulling from different types of sources, you will have an overrepresentation of certain populations and underrepresentation of others.
I agree with them. It's where you're pulling your pool of data from. If you are pulling your data from incarceration, it's going to be highly skewed toward the African American community. So.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you, guys. Good.
And you talked earlier about some of this being like a mirror, because also there may be some unconscious biases that we've taught or included in our algorithms. So I remember seeing a presentation of someone talking about AI, and they were saying, yeah, here's what we do. If you want your AI to know it's a dog, you show them, 500 pictures of a dog. This is a dog, this is a dog, this is a dog. Well, maybe you didn't include the miniatures, and so then it wouldn't recognize the miniature dogs.
That's a great example. Thank you. So yeah, some of the answers that I got to come up with were, first, the underlying data is the issue. Thinking about the data, is it fully representative? If not, we're talking about bias. Also, algorithms are subject to human influence through data. Algorithms come from us, they're created by us, and then they bake in our own biases if we have them. And then the third thought is, this algorithm and many algorithms can even affect some populations more than others. We call this disparate impact, and then that feeds into more bias in the future. So these are all things that we're thinking about. So I have another question for you guys. When you think about the word bias, what is the first thing that pops up in your head?
It's bad. You shouldn't have bias.
There are levels to it, some conscious, some unconscious. So the more conscious one you can work against, but if it's unconscious, first you gotta recognize it's there.
Thank you. So my next question is, do you think bias can affect data?
Yes, of course.
Great, that's what I wanted to get to. So yeah, our stance is that bias affects algorithms, absolutely. This is because bias first affects people, and then people affect data, and we use data to create algorithms. So our stance in the toolkit that we're going to get to is that all people have bias, therefore all data have bias, therefore all algorithms will have bias. So when we're thinking about bias in algorithms, we must first address data. Algorithms learn from data to become appropriate models of that data. So we have to really think about who accumulates, creates structures, and even populates data. People. Every person carries with them some sort of bias, and that's what we have to think about. So there's a phrase in computer science that encompasses this topic. It's called garbage in, garbage out. I don't know if you've heard about that. Yeah. So adapted, our version is bias in, bias out. So again, the toolkit that we mentioned earlier really gets into these topics and thinks about bias specifically, as well as other things that might be going on in the data and can affect algorithms. So I have another question for you guys. All these issues that we've just talked about, how do you view them? How do you view like bias or other data inaccuracy, representativeness? Do you have a plan in your job to resolve these issues? How do you address them in your jobs, if at all? Okay.
We have an iterative approach through a feedback loop in order to try to identify where there are issues, right? Obviously, that's not going to catch everything, right? But just by ensuring that you have a built-in feedback loop and you're always iterating, you can make those improvements.
We try to use diverse teams. Diversity is many different shapes and sizes and types of diversity, but use a diverse team to create the thinking in the first place, so many perspectives are considered and not just one.
I'm sorry, I have a question about the word bias. I'm not sure. Are we saying that all bias is bad and undesirable? Are we saying that are you using bias as a term of the unexpected or unanticipated parts of an algorithm? Because, I mean, isn't bias about making choices and it didn't quite make the choice you expected, but an algorithm is about making choices, right?
Yeah.
So is all bias bad?
Well, I would say we don't necessarily, in this presentation, I'm suggesting bias can be tenuous, but in our toolkit that we created, we don't necessarily say that bias is this terrible thing, just that it exists, and that you should be aware of it, and there are things you can do to account for it. The other thing is that we split the word bias in two, so we really thought about the differences between historical bias, which can have more of these social ties, versus, bias within data itself. So accuracy, representativeness, and so on. So we split it out. I don't know if Andrew, you want to touch on that?
No, I think that was actually a really great answer. So.
Thank you. So I kind of asked this already, but is anyone using a particular framework to think about these issues and algorithms, or just kind of ad hoc?
It's not so much an algorithm, but what we do, so take performance appraisal data, as well as we have an annual cycle promotion process as well. One of the things that we've done just to not so much act on bias that is in the information, but be aware of it and understand to what extent it is influencing results. Not to be too nerdy, but we actually then do a chi-square and then odds ratio test, just to see if we have this population, so what are the odds that a member of that population would get this result. And so what we'll do is we'll do that with both of those major processes and just get a sense of, okay, we know that this demographic group on average has this % odds of getting this result. It just helps us, one, to sort of rationalize what's going on, but then also to tell the story when the numbers, absent of that background or that story, if you will, could potentially lead to one conclusion when it really doesn't with what's going on in the data. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
So I would say that, I respect that process, those processes, I think they're great. But the other thing to think about is being proactive. So the toolkit we've created really we think it's something that can be used throughout the life cycle of an algorithm, even before you choose data, really. It's something that can be used in tandem with that. So really, if you're using something that helps you think about some of these issues before you even implement your algorithm, you could be, changing outcomes potentially. So,
Miriam, kind of responding to a couple of your last questions, we advise and support several different agencies as they use artificial intelligence, and one of the things I've found is it's kind of like the use of an algorithm and an automated technique gives people some glasses that give them a much better focus. So then it becomes much easier, if you're looking for it, to find bias. Whereas it might not have been easy at all beforehand, but you still have to kind of look for it. And so what I've experienced, for example, is as we help one agency that's supporting public health through grants, they've begun using some of the artificial intelligence to essentially kind of pick out, all right, which public health clinics are achieving really good outcomes, and let's kind of favor them or find out what they're doing and then try and draw that lesson out elsewhere. So previously, before they had kind of this automated technique, they had no idea perhaps whether there's bias involved or not. Now, bluntly, we and they have not really started looking for it yet, but I think now we have the tools to look for it. So I guess kind of my theory is it may be hard to find bias until you have these techniques, but once you have these techniques, that's not really sufficient. Then you've kind of got the magnifying glass or the focus, then you can start looking for it if you choose to.
Or how often do we get caught in the, I can't see the forest for the trees? If it is your bias and you're in the middle of it, how often are you likely to catch that bias? unless you have another set of eyes, another perspective, as we said, diversity, all looking at the same things.
Or a nonpartisan framework or a toolkit. That's also a point.
1 point.
Yeah, to your point, Jeff, I think that's a really interesting point. I guess I would say, you know, even in thinking about these headlines, so progress is a tenuous slope. You know, we're trying to move forward. Nowadays, you're going to start seeing, you know, articles that study artificial intelligence more and more. And, you know, we in the toolkit suggest that there are two sides to this. There's lots of duality. So you're going to have these systems that can quickly come to results, but then also they're going to have some of the, you know, a dark side to them too. So we really think about both sides to everything. I don't know if you want to add. Okay. So I've mentioned this toolkit lots of times. Hopefully I'm embedding the name of it into your heads. It's called the Ethics and Algorithms Toolkit. So the creation of this toolkit was a mutual effort by Data SF, which is San Francisco, Data Community DC, which is here in Washington, DC, the Center for Government Excellence, and then Harvard's Ash Center. The tool was born through a day-long data science workshop in San Francisco last year, and it transformed into the toolkit that we see today. We focus a lot on risk mitigation. So a lot of effort was put into creating this tool. We met almost every week to discuss new developments, incorporate new ideas, edit, and more. And we hope that you might find it useful. You know, now you know that it exists. We're always trying to iterate and incorporate feedback into it. So if anyone has any comments afterwards, we'd be happy to hear them. And I just want to leave you guys with this. Algorithms and their evaluation always will require humans. You know, sometimes, again, I'm mentioning the news, but you hear articles of like humans are being automated, or people are, you know, less and less necessary as computers like become more strong in the mainstream. But we suggest that algorithms are always going to require humans, and more technology is not always the answer. So yeah, knowing this is crucial as we head into more technologically advanced society. So if any of you have time or any thoughts or questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Again, I'm going to stop talking in a second and open this up to more questions. But thank you, and we both have business cards if anyone wants to talk to us.
Okay, she has business cards. I forgot to bring mine.
I have business cards.
Can I add a few more things to this?
Yeah.
So I just want to add a little bit of color and context. So first of all, we haven't told you where it is, so we should do that. So it's ethicstoolkit.ai, so that's the URL. And we have, it's released under a Creative Commons license, so you can take it, use it, rework it, do whatever you're going to do to it. I think the vision for us is that we want to maintain a version of it for government. I don't know that it's best suited for federal versus local, and so it'd be interesting to have some folks in the federal space try it. We sort of live in the local space, so it's a little bit harder for us to understand the federal context, so I just want to put that thing around it. So if you actually take a look at this and you say like, well, this, you know, adding this piece would be really valuable for us, or like, you know, this other mitigation strategy is something that we have the ability to apply, that's all great insight for us, and we can take that and plug it back into the toolkit. But also, we know that like some governments have already taken this and adapted it for their own work, right? So they've taken it, you know, make some tweaks to it, and they're now applying it to their processes internally. So as they build new data science projects through the pipeline, they put this toolkit into place to help them do some evaluation around it. So ethicstoolkit.ai. And the other thing that I would add for context is, I don't think we're saying that algorithms are bad. I mean, it's really easy. I mean, especially in kind of the space that we live in, it's really easy to say like, we shouldn't use these things at all, like they're just going to be the downfall of society. And I don't think that's actually true. I think the challenge that we're facing is that we have an exponentially growing stream of data, and we do not have the human capacity to understand all of that data, right? So we need tools to get in there and help us gain insights and, scan millions of records to help us sort of figure out what's going on. And so we really do need these things, but we also have to be careful about using them responsibly, creating them responsibly, and making decisions about whether we should continue to use them. And so, as Miriam said, like the life cycle of an algorithm is also particularly important. But I think it gets even more messy when we start thinking about what the future holds. When I give a different talk, I have this very like science fiction version of the future, and one of the slides that I put up is this picture of the HAL 9000 computer system from 2001. And my little bit of rhetoric around that is that like HAL is this computer system that controls this entire spaceship, and this is the world of science fiction that was written in the 1960s and imagined to happen 20 years before where we are now. And the idea was this computer would sort of manage everything, and he was given, he's a massive set of algorithms, right, if you think about him in those kinds of terms. He was given two competing sets of priorities to deal with. And you don't know this until you see the sequel to 2001, but he's basically given a set of instructions that's like, go do this, keep these people safe. And by the way, here's this other mission that you can't tell these first people about, but you're gonna have to, you're gonna have to figure out how to work this out, and so HAL decides he's gonna kill everybody. My point in this example is that like we're starting to get to the place, and we're going to see this more and more, where AI and algorithms are going to get layered on top of each other. And the effects of that are even more scary and more uncertain and more unpredictable than what we're looking at here with these sort of one-shot things. And we don't really have a conversation for that yet. And I think we need to start figuring out what that space looks like too, because you're going to have an AI product that takes the output from another AI product and feeds it into another one. And that has all kinds of really interesting consequences. And the one sort of real world example that I have kind of that is to do with Amazon Alexa. And so a couple of years ago, this little kid was like, hey Alexa, order me a castle. And so Alexa did that, and Amazon delivered a toy castle to the parents' door. And the parents were like, whoa, where did this toy castle come from? And Amazon was like, oh crap, kids can order stuff, so let's switch that off. So they did. But a local news station picked up on the story. And so they repeated the phrase, Alexa, buy me a castle, on the air, and then all the Alexas that happened to be in range of the TV broadcast, all the televisions, the people were watching the news, and they had Alexas in their rooms, all those Alexas ordered castles, right? So, luckily that's sort of the thing that, you can nail in the bud pretty quickly, because you just say, let's cancel all the castle orders in this geographic area at this time. But that's the point. There's all these sort of weird unintended consequences that come up. You can't necessarily predict how things are going to be used or what's going to come out of them. And so, I think there's this whole dialogue in the private sector at the moment. All the conversations with Amazon Recognition and Microsoft calling for regulation of facial recognition, even though they're selling it quietly. There's all these sort of challenges around this, and we have both an obligation to act on a policy level, which I think is starting to happen now in Congress, but we also have an obligation to do it in our own jobs, in our own places of work, right? Because for me, the reason why I wanted to work on this toolkit was to help the local governments that I work with not be one of those news articles. And so we started off with the whole premise of this is risk avoidance. And I would be really interested if folks have some experience around this. I know how to do some basic risk management stuff, and so that's how we kind of architected the toolkit. But what I'd love to be able to do is estimate value of that. So how much did we help you avoid by you applying this tool? Because that's actually really useful insight for us, and we don't have the right skills in our organization to be able to help calculate that. So we would love input and insight for that particular part of it. Anyway, that's my spiel for 30 seconds.
Thank you. And thank you guys.
So I have a really basic question, and I apologize if it's a stupid question. What is the toolkit? Is it an application that we send algorithms through? Is it an application that looks at the results and then reverse engineers to what the algorithm should be? I didn't get that as part of the message.
So right now, the toolkit is, it can either be used online as a PDF, or you can print it out, bring it to your job, have a conversation with people in person. We are thinking about making it into more of a web programmable application that you can use online. But right now we're still very much old school, and it's on GitHub, it lives, and the PDFs are available to you guys, but.
So still not getting it, sorry.
So it's not a tool, it's not a technical tool, right? You're not gonna give it your algorithm or your R code or whatever, your Python code, and it's going to say like, ooh, there's bias. Now that's not what we're doing here at all, right? And it doesn't even look at data. It's completely non-technical. And actually, we feel pretty strongly that like technical solutions on top of this challenge are actually the wrong way to go. So, you know, like we've seen like IBM and Microsoft, these sort of big tech houses, put out these like anti-bias technical products, right? And I'm sure they have some value. I'm not trying to dismiss them. What I'm saying is that you can't just look at this from a technology point of view. And so what we're trying to introduce is a little bit more of a human and a process component to this, right? So what you have is basically a risk assessment framework, and it says it's going to ask you like, you know, 7 or 8 questions. Those are broken down into individual steps with distinct questions in each, and you're eventually going to, you're ultimately going to come up with a low, medium, high scoring for each of those buckets, and then past that part of it, there's also a worksheet, so it makes it easy to fill out. And then past that part of it, we have a mitigation framework. And so what that does is it looks at the kinds of risks that you have, or the characteristics of your algorithm, and then says, okay, if this is something that's going to affect a large amount of the population in a potentially negative way, then these are the kinds of things you want to be able to consider on it. And by the way, one of those things is maybe you shouldn't do it at all. But
So it's an assessment framework.
yeah.
You're taking your approach and methodology for how you're building your algorithms. You're asking a series of questions and basically giving it rankings and scores. And
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
The toolkit is what kind of twisted in my head. Thank you.
It's a fair question. I really do.
I wonder if someone came up with a pretty concrete example, would we have enough time between now and 10, 35 minutes to maybe walk through an example and so people could get a better understanding?
Yeah, I mean, we can go quickly through it. I think there's a lot more in-depth stuff in the toolkit that actually requires like more detailed conversation. So I think we can if we can also agree to make like 10 billion assumptions, then we can go ahead and do
So
it.
I can offer such an example, but let me defer to see if anybody else in the room would like to. Okay, so the example is REI works with a number of grant-making agencies, which include scientific grant-making agencies. They want to identify the panel of independent reviewers who's going to select the grants. Of course, typically it's not an employee of the agency and it's not the person who's applied for the grant. It must be other people who have appropriate expertise. What we found with a number of our clients is they have a concern of the good old boys network. Same set of people selecting grantees all the time. Doesn't necessarily promote innovation, could promote discrimination. And so they've asked us, and we've suggested to them kind of in tandem, hey, maybe we could get over this good old boy network bias if instead what we did was we ingested a bunch of resumes of potential panelists and used artificial intelligence to help suggest candidate panels. And so the question is, you know, again, we're developing this in tandem with a couple of clients. The question is, how might you apply this tool to make sure that actually, in fact, perhaps the panels are not even more biased coming in based on the artificial intelligence than they might be right now based on the kind of good old boys network of the person selecting the panels?
So is everybody else good with this as like a foundation for having this conversation?
Yeah.
Do you mind if I?
Oh, go ahead.
Okay.
Do you want me to pull it up?
Yeah, actually that would be really great. Just the worksheet, I think. So we're actually going to bring up it's a worksheet. It's several pages long, but at least you'll get to see sort of what we're interacting with. There's a companion document to the worksheet which actually goes into this stuff in a whole lot of detail, including like, you know, kind of like when you should classify things as low, medium, or high. What are the kind of criteria that help you sort of bucket the characteristics? I try not to call them risks because they're characteristics, and in some cases they are risks, but in other cases they're actually good. So you know. But the first question we actually ask is like, who are the affected communities and how are they going to be affected, right? And so this is a really open-ended question, kind of deliberately. And I can, just off the top of my head from hearing you describe the thing, I can think of a few, right? So it's the people who are potential panelists, the people who are panelists, the people who are selecting the panelists. It's also in a very indirect sense, it's also the people who are ultimately affected by those grants. So are there other kind of audiences, and this can be both explicit audiences and implicit audiences, or you know, groups of people who would be affected in maybe unexpected ways?
The big ones I think of would be the people who want the grant money. Presumably not all of them are going to get it.
Yeah.
And eventually kind of the people who have benefit from the grant research. You know, maybe they get a different character of research result depending on what panel selects what grant.
Yeah. Okay.
Or what grant applicant.
So what we do with this, and this is the part that I want to sort of gloss over because it is actually pretty time intensive, is we actually look at each one of those audiences and we say, okay, what are the potential effects and we do that from a number of different standpoints, and we have a kind of a framework in there for that. Is it economic? Is it health and safety? Is it happiness? Those sorts of things. And then we ask you to make some degree of evaluation about whether you're going to have a positive effect on them or not, or a negative effect on them or not, right? So we're asking you to not just choose who is affected and how they're affected, but also is it good or bad? And the last question that we ask around this is around scale. So how much, right? So are you going to be really badly affected, and are you affecting a lot of people, or is it a really small audience that maybe that's okay, right? So this first question is actually kind of a doozy, and we really expect people to sit in a room and have a series of conversations around this particular question. Are you having
technical difficulties?
No problem.
You're doing great. Well, I'll see.
I do know the toolkit really well. I mean, we helped write it.
So
That's the first question is the easiest one for me to remember. Right? The rest of them are a little more tricky. But please go ahead.
you were talking about people. I was actually also thinking, well, what about the universities? They get a big cut of that money. So when you're talking about people, are you only talking about people, or are you also talking about organizations, or how do you dice and slice that?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And I don't know, because we've oriented this specifically at municipal governments, or because our basic familiarity with municipal governments, our bias is now in this toolkit, right? I don't know that we've actually tried to figure that part out. I mean, I think we tend to assume that audiences, that segments are collections of human beings. And so, I mean, you could treat a university as a collection of human beings with a certain set of aims. I don't know. I mean, it's a really interesting question. So I'd like you to figure out the answer to that and then tell us what we should do to change the toolkit to improve it. So where are we here? Is this
This is part one.
Okay.
Can we get a copy of that mailed to us? Because when I get back to the office, I'm not sure if our service will let us go to your site.
I will, for everyone who's registered for this, I'll make sure you get a physical, a PDF copy of that as an attachment to an email, as well as the URL in case you are able to access it.
So can you actually go to the worksheet? Or
Okay.
This is the descriptive one, right? So this is the website with its really snazzy purple design. I'm not really a web designer. I don't think anybody on our team is, so you did really good. What I've been describing here is really this first step of this process, right? So we've got things like, is there a way to zoom it,
Control plus.
Oh, there we go. So, what are the kinds of, just at the top of the screen there is like, what are the kinds of things that you might be affecting? How significant is the effect that you're going to have? How wide is the effect that you're going to have? Like, is it a lot of people? Is it a small number of people? And then what we're trying to do is, this is actually a very difficult part, what we're trying to do is sort of narrow that down into almost like a one-dimensional value, which is incredibly hard. And this is why it takes people a lot of time to get through it. But what we're trying to understand is, okay, do you have like a very, very small impact that maybe this, like you can apply this algorithm and there'll be some bias with it, but it won't cause a whole lot of harm? Or are you talking about like an incarcerated population where you're literally affecting people's lives for 20 years and their financial outlooks and their families and all of that, right? Those are very different scales of problems, and so we want to reflect that in this. So let's skip past question one. And so now we're talking about appropriate use of data. And this is not really a question about the bias, we'll get to that in a second, but what we're talking about here is, are you using the data in a way that's expected? So you might be feeding a bunch of data into an algorithm, but that data can come from a variety of sources. It may not have been collected for the purposes of which you're using it, right? And so what we're trying to get you to assess here is like, are you using it with the intent that makes sense? And we're even asking the question of like, okay, if you use it in this way, are people going to hate you for it, right? And so like, sometimes the answer to that is yes, or probably not. Probably most people think it's okay for us to use like taxpayer information to calculate something else, right? So that turns into another risk score, another kind of low, medium, high framing. And then we start to look at the accountability side of things, right? So you've probably all heard of the sort of like transparency, accountability, and there's an F in there, isn't there?
Fairness?
Fairness, right. So you've probably all heard about like fairness, accountability, and transparency, or the kind of the FAT concept. That's baked in here as well. But it's pretty specific. So here we're talking about accountability, and the question is like, okay, you have an algorithm. Are you letting it make decisions without any human review at all? Or is there like a person in the process who can sort of mitigate what the algorithm is doing, maybe make a different decision based upon other circumstances? So think about the compass example that we talked about in the beginning, right? So the compass score goes in front of a judge. The judge has to look at that score and say, well, this is a 97, so I'm gonna just, no bail. So there is a human intervention there, and what we're not asking, we should be asking probably, is like, how good is that human intervention? Because we know in the case of Compass, research is suggesting that judges they blindly follow that score. They don't know how it's created. It's sort of popped in there, and they say, well, if I see a score with this, this is a decision I'm gonna make. So we also look at things like, is the algorithm easy to explain? Like, do you have the source code to it, or is it a black box? Is this if it's provided by a vendor, do you really have an insight into how it works? These will sort of feed into the accountability question. And then we very specifically have a section around third-party methodology. And the reason for this is because so much of what we do is often developed by vendors, right? And so from the government space. So if you are working with a vendor partner, how much control and influence do you have over what's going on there, right? So unfortunately, you can't see the actual questions that we're asking because this is just the worksheet, but we have a list of questions in here, and it's things like, can you hold the vendor accountable? Can you go back and tell them to make changes because there are tuning issues, or you're already seeing bias challenges or bias results that you need to be able to fix. Those are the kinds of questions that we want to know, because we want to know how much influence you have over the direction of the product, right? And so when you're working with a vendor, that gets a little complicated because you are not their only client typically. Oh, so here are the questions. So if you're the director owners of the algorithm, great, you have a lot of control over that. You get a point. If you are periodically reviewing decisions the algorithm has made and then update the algorithm to sort of adapt to the changing landscape, great, you get a point for that. We think the more points, the better. So this is an example of what we do with third-party risk. And then we talked about how we split bias into two different parts. So there is a historic bias context, and there's a data bias context, or a technical bias context. And the historic bias is really around, are you using data that's 20 years old? Or using data that has been collected for 40 years, but only is oriented towards a certain demographic audience. Again, we tend to think about this in the local government space, where there's a lot of interaction between communities and the government, and it gets, these become really significant issues really quickly. But also government legacy systems, as they collect data for 50 years. And so if you're taking your algorithm and making choices on 50 years worth of data, as opposed to say the last 5, what are you doing to affect the potential outcomes? And then we go into the technical side of data bias, right? So is it representative of the audience? So in the case of Compass, we know that the data that is based upon is typically of incarcerated individuals and doesn't include people who have never been a part of the justice system, right? So that's not a representative data set at that point. Now there may be ways to address that, but it's not a representative data set, so maybe you don't get a high score for that. We also look at inaccuracy, which is a little bit different from representativeness. Representativeness is missing records. Inaccuracy is records that are there but don't necessarily reflect the reality, or may not reflect the exact reality that you need for your use case. And then we kind of mesh those together into a kind of a low, medium, high score as well. And then, yeah, please.
Quick question for you. So, just from what this is, and I apologize if it's the wrong assumption, the wrong takeaway. It looks like the way that you quantify the results is just through a basic 1 point for a yes or a positive response to a question. Has there been any thought about weighting one question or one area higher than others? Any thought to a risk priority number system that you'd have a failure most effect analysis on, or something along those lines?
Yeah. Yes. Do you want to speak to that, or do you want to?
You were the mind behind it,
So there is implicit weighting in this, in how the actual thing is structured. So you see here, we're actually asking you a series of questions. Mm-hmm. So we're in step 6.2 right now, right? So you might say, okay, the source of the training data is local, and what we mean by that is is it yours or is it from some other context? The example I like to give for this is ShotSpotter. So ShotSpotter is a system of deployed microphones in an urban environment that can tell when a gunshot has been fired, and then it sends a signal to the police department saying, hey, we think there's a gunshot that's been fired at this place. And ShotSpotter is actually smart enough to be able to tell you the type of weapon that was fired based upon the audio characteristics. So it's an AI, and it does some locational sensing and all that. But I could imagine that in this situation you would not want it to use local data because you might only have a subset of the types of weapons that exist in the world. You might only have a small number of those in your community, and so it wouldn't necessarily be representative, right? And so what you're looking for is the data in the right context for the work that you're trying to do? And so in some cases, if you're talking about like human data, about people in your community, you might not want the national context because it's not representative of what's going on in your community, but in other cases you do. So what we're trying to figure out here is like, you know, how relevant the data is to your problem. We're also asking you if you care about that, right? So first we ask you where the data comes from, and then we ask you where it should come from, and then we mesh those two together to say, okay, well, this is a low risk or a high risk based upon whether those things disagree. So they're pretty specific questions. And the thing I'm getting to about the kind of implicit weighting is that we then take that question and this question and the one before it. So all these, we're in step 6, but we're doing 6.1 is a question, 6.2 is a question, 6.3 is a question. And then what we do is, just bring this up a little bit, 6.4, sorry. We're combining these together, right? So we're saying, we're gonna give you a total evaluation for your technical bias based upon those previous questions that we asked. So there's weighting in there's not weighting in the individual questions that we're asking in that section, but there's weighting in terms of like how technical bias relates to like the rest of the bias factors that we're talking about. We did talk about doing a little bit more weighting, so like, you know, this should be 25%, this should be 10% sort of thing. And I think that we weren't quite comfortable with that yet, because we also need to see this being used in the field a little bit to be able to say like, okay, these factors actually turn out to be much more important than those factors. And so our groupings in this are kind of logical and like make sense from a conversation point of view, but it's not clear to us that like 6.3 is actually more important or less important than 6.2, so we didn't go into that kind of level of weighting. So does that answer your question about how that works?
Somewhat, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the reality is that it's an algorithm, right? Like it's a paper algorithm, but it's still an algorithm. And this is why also we want people to sort of look at it and adapt it and change it to meet their needs, because we know we can't predict every situation, and we know we can't, we know that it's going to have to go through a series of iterations in order to get to be really good.
Have any of your partners been through a performance audit with this practice that you know of?
I'm not quite sure what that question means, I guess.
So coming from GAO, one of the things, so if I were to do this, one of the questions that I would be asked is, well, what methodology did you rely upon? And if it was not explicitly defined, I would basically have an audit finding indicating that it was not defined, was not using, X, Y, or Z best practices.
Yeah.
And so what since you're in sort of the infancy, from what it sounds like with this, I would just suggest it might behoove you to use industry standards that are, quote, out there that are generally accepted, just to add a little bit more credit to this, and I'm not questioning the credibility of this whatsoever.
Actually, you should.
Well, but I think that there are things that you could think about. So one of the things that we've done is, you might think it's a little strange, but NASA has really descriptive qualitative outcome definitions of 10 areas of risk. And we've taken a look at that and started to use that and got audited on that. I was able to point, well, here's the NASA literature on this. This is what they've used. We thought that this would make sense. That's sort of what I'm going after, is if you can have that type of documentation, just from your customer's perspective, being local governments that are subject to accountability and review, that would be a very good thing for them to have, or something like that to adopt.
I think that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I would say that there are actually parts of this that are grounded in other work that's been done, right? So we didn't create this out of a vacuum.
Yeah.
There are pieces of it that we synthesized because it made sense in kind of the context that we work with local governments and to some extent with state governments. And it also, to be frank, is based upon two of the partners having pretty extensive experience working in local government, myself and the chief data officer from San Francisco was a part of this, to bring that context of like, well, what do we actually think we can reasonably ask people? Because there's a little bit of the, like, I don't want to make this toolkit so onerous that people are like, oh God, we're putting another gateway and another barrier into this process. But I also don't want them to, I want it to be just the right amount of friction that they go like, okay, we're going to get the right benefits out of this if we do this, and it'll be a little bit painful, but we'll go through the process, and we're not going to have that story in the local media that says that we're, sending extra people to jail, or worse, actually sending people to jail that shouldn't be. So I think there's sort of a balancing act that we're trying to produce there, and also, like, to your point, like, it's not just this that's in its infancy; it's the entire field, right? So we've tried to put a stake in the ground that we think works in kind of a government context, but there certainly are other frameworks out there for assessing the ethics and risk around algorithms. It's actually really interesting because the private sector, by comparison, is like in complete disarray on this stuff, right? Like, I mean, how does a company like Facebook even figure out how to do this when their audience is scattered across the globe, and there are so many different types of impacts that could possibly arise from the platform and the way it works? So, I think our job here is to put something out there. We don't think it's perfect on the first try. Be open to, and this is part of the conversation we want to have with you folks, be open to that feedback of tweak it in this way, tweak it in that way. As other people take it and reuse it, we also want to know about that so we can understand how people have changed it to meet their needs, and we can figure out whether that sort of should flow back into the core product. We're also working with one of the partners that was D for D up there, Data for Democracy, was in that thing? So one of the partners we're working with, Data for Democracy, is a national organization that's hooked into like Mozilla and Knight and Epic and all these other sort of like advocacy organizations, right? And so we're trying to get them to take this toolkit and port it over into other sectors. Like we have some access to the education sector, obviously, but into the private sector, into the NGO landscape. I mean, these are all sort of areas where we think there's potential, because from every observation that we have, there's maybe like 6 toolkits in the world that really do this kind of thing, and we have no idea if any of them do it particularly well.
Has it been applied, and have the results of that application been made public?
It has been applied, the results have not been made public, and this is sort of the delicate position that we're in, because if a government goes ahead and uses this toolkit, there is a real interesting set of like questions and challenges that come up with just that process, right? So like, one of the obvious ones is like, does it come under like Public Records Act, and do you have to expose that? And what if it surfaces something that's particularly bad and your political leader doesn't want to sort of get into that hot water? It's a really messy landscape for us to be in, so we've deliberately kind of supported a group of governments who are using this, but we sort of said, would you please talk about it? But we completely understand the hesitancy around like being public about this stuff, because at some point it's going to get forced into the spotlight. We just know this is going to be true, right? But I would rather help leaders head that stuff off at the pass rather than again be that story in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or whatever about disparate impact. So that was a really weird way of answering that question, but I think I come from government. I really understand the intricacies and the nuance of like how you balance that stuff. So,
how would you envision evaluating the effectiveness of this? Because that obviously seems very tricky. Given that you don't know what the counterfactual would be. So, like in your mind, what would be a good way of conducting a quantitative evaluation?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, this is a really open question for me, and I think where we could use a lot of support. It's not, my background is not in being able to evaluate that. I mean, I understand sort of risk management at kind of a large scale and knew how to take specific techniques and help us put it into the toolkit. But one of the big questions I have is, how do you manage something? How do you measure the results of something that you avoided, right? Like,
right.
Which I mean, there must be an answer to that. I just don't know what it looks like.
Have you come across an instance where you have 2 separate partners who are considering implementing similar programs and, we're basically a natural experiment.
Yeah, I mean, there actually is one. Where's my phone ringing? Sorry, go away. And where are you on? Okay, now we're on vibrant mode. Apologies. There is actually it's one situation, it's in two very major US cities where they're doing the same implementation type of work at the same time, and we're trying to get the toolkit applied to both of those projects.
Don't just do one, right?
Yeah, definitely don't just do one.
Right, yeah.
So at least we would be able to get that comparative sense of what's going on. But this is the use case is a really good one, but the politics around them are pretty gnarly, and so we're trying to, and even then, like even if we were able to do that comparative analysis internally, I'm really not sure that we would be able to talk about it in kind of a much more open context because of the sensitivities. But I don't know. This is all this is kind of stick flag in the ground. I mean, I really look. There's this little secret part of me, and I'm sure Miriam too, where it's like somebody's going to come along and tell us that we completely effed this up and it was the wrong approach, and we should be thinking about something else entirely. And I'm sort of like emotionally prepared for that, but also like,
I have to say this kind of screams to me, hey, here's a dissertation topic for a PhD candidate where, especially if you're thinking at the state and local level, find 10 different, local governments of one type who are about to implement AI and say, maybe 10's not enough, all right, maybe 50, and say, all right, well, 25 of you, we are going to randomly assign you to the test group, and 25 others, we're going to randomly assign you to the control group, and the ones who are in the test group, we want you to use this. And if you, again, say, let's pretend they're all doing it with respect to housing, look and see, with some objective post facto evaluation, was there more bias with some specific metrics in cases of the control group versus the test group. So if you want an idea for a dissertation topic, I think this, that's the only way I can imagine to try and really determine, does this make a difference?
I like it.
Now, you'd have to get somebody to fund that. Maybe GAO would want to fund that, who knows? Maybe HUD would want to fund that.
Could you get to the chase into a summary report? Is there a summary, here's the heat chart or whatever it is you show?
Yeah, so that, go back to this is actually kind of it, right? It's a bunch of pages, it's 5 pages long, and it's sort of like check marks along the way. That doesn't really condense down into one page because we do want to be able to show like, at least low, medium, high. So this is essentially, there's like a document that describes all the stuff and how to categorize it, and then there's a worksheet, which is what we're looking at right here.
This is the summary?
Yeah.
The reason I asked the question is, you envision we make the pitch. We're going to use an algorithm to do X, Y, and Z. We got to sell it up the political chain. Mm-hmm. You can't get somebody to sit in a room and read through a 27-page report, right?
No.
How do you consolidate it down to a 30-minute conversation around, here's what we did, here's the results, we want your recommendation or your support to go forward?
So we wrestled with this question, but maybe in a little bit of a different way. So the question that we were asking ourselves was, is there a overall valuation of risk that we can create from this kind of a low, very low to very high, sort of 5-tier thing, which basically would consolidate the answers from all 6 of the major questions in there and put them down into one thing. So, conceivably you could put on one page the 5 or 6 results and sort of dashboard that, and I don't think that would be particularly difficult to do, and honestly, like, people are much more creative than I in terms of just putting that onto a page, so go for it. We weren't sure about distilling it down into like that one score because we're not sure of the weighting, which, talking back to the other question, also like there's a lot of nuance in this stuff, and I mean, you guys know you're doing this. It's not, even when you're talking to a leader about risk, they have to have some insight into like what that pattern, what the characteristics look like. And I think getting it down to like the 6 high-level buckets is probably okay. I don't know that you would want to go higher level than that. The other part of that is that if you're doing this right, we don't have a lot of guidance around sort of how you should work through this process, right? I mean, we're sort of navigating that with different governments at the moment. And ideally, there's a little bit more documentation at some point that we need to create that's like, here's how you start this, here's where you apply this, here's how you maintain it going forwards and all that. If you're doing this right, at least for some parts of the conversation, your executive leadership is in the room. We, particularly for like the impacts part of it in the beginning, we try to orient this towards middle management because we think that's where the paradigm shifts are going to happen, right? So you as like a program manager are going to be the person who says, I need to think about how to optimize this or how to make better choices. What are the tools that I can bring into place to do that? And that's where the rubber meets the road in terms of like AI implementation. And so that's what we tried to target. We are, part of the reason for our partnership with Harvard is to figure out sort of what that executive piece looks like and what do we bubble up to, like, you know, a mayor or a city manager or a commissioner or, you know, what have you. And I think that's also input and insight that we would love to get from you folks if you get a chance to try it out.
In terms of thinking about its effectiveness, it might also be worthwhile to consider public opinion and thinking about how you want to decrease not only actual bias but also perceived bias. Yeah, so if you have any data on trust in government and people's feelings toward their government officials, you know, does that decrease once they know that their government officials are considering the bias that is being used? Like, do they trust their government officials more? Or do they have more faith that their government is acting in their best interest? That kind of thing. So another way to think about how you could talk about the value that this brings.
Yeah. So another area where we've kind of focused actually on that topic is around open data. And so part of what we do is we have, like, beyond the AI stuff, what we actually do is work with governments on evidence-based practices in government, right? So like just getting your data, harnessing it, using it more effectively for a variety of means. And open data is a part of that, and we've been watching in a part of the open data movement for the last 10 years since it kind of spun up here in DC in 2008. And weirdly enough, at least from the Pew statistics, trust in government has gone down over the last 10 years, despite the fact that there's actually like a radical increase in transparency. And so there's a really interesting research question that I think is being floated at the moment, which is like, if you are radically transparent, does that actually get you any benefit? And it might, the connection there might be no. I think there's a lot of question around that still. So I don't know in a local context what that brings. I mean, I do think that there's some shift in trust and things like that, but the question is whether it makes enough of a dent to be measurable.
Yeah, and just thinking back to like some of the initial question you posed was, right, like how do these headlines make you feel? So right, so we'd want to, like, if people know that this toolkit is being implemented, does that make them feel differently about all these algorithms that are out there? Yeah.
So Andrew, to a certain extent, following on Jean's question and the kind of the hypothetical I set up, let's say I'm talking with two clients, NASA and the National Science Foundation, and they're trying to decide, should they use artificial intelligence in order to be able to improve selection of their review panels and perhaps reduce the good old boy thing. It does seem to me like it's important to say, well, we've applied this algorithm, and the answer is no, you should not use artificial intelligence, or yes, you should. I presume the algorithm is going to say, well, here's how to do it better and with less bias if you're going to use it. Does it or should it help conclude, yes, you should use it, or no, you should not, NASA?
So we do kind of do that, right? So the one other document that you haven't looked at on the screen is like now that you understand the sort of low, medium, high around this, what do you do as a result of that? And so for each of those 6 things, depending upon your score, we have some recommendations around, you know, sort of if it's low, then maybe you want to think about this. If it's really high, then maybe you want to institute these other practices to support it, right? They vary by, the types of things you can do vary by the types of problems you have. If it's a data bias problem, you do some things. If it's a human impact problem, you take a different approach. I think that there's some recommendation in like the overview that says like, listen, if you're showing like red flags across the board, you might want to think about terminating the project. I don't think we can take a hard stand on that though, because honestly, in some ways, this stuff is going to be inevitable. Like, I mean, we talked about sort of the deluge of data and all that. Like, in some cases, I think that people are going to have like this sort of red dashboard for this assessment, and they're not going to have any choice but to apply the algorithm or the tool. I can imagine 1 or 2 scenarios like that. And in that case, the best we can do is say like, okay, here's the 10,000 things you have to do to manage that problem, right? So here's what you can see here is like an example of like the kind of stuff that we do.
Could you zoom in?
Yes.
So this document is actually broken up into two pieces. So what we do is we say, it's like an if this then that thing. So, you know, it's like, okay, if you're green or yellow, then this. And then we actually describe each one of the strategies that you can take, right? So we say like, okay, create an IRB, and then that mitigation 3 is actually hyperlink, so then it will jump to, you know, a section further down where we actually describe what those things are. This isn't a particularly rich piece of information, by the way. Like, this could honestly bear a lot more fleshing out, and or other techniques that we're not aware of or what have you, right? So again, stake in the ground kind of stuff. But I do think that, like, you know, yeah, if you're like, if all 6 of your things are bright red, then the recommendation might be like, yeah, maybe don't put this down. But, you know, to be honest with you, Miriam talked about this in the beginning. Some of this stuff is about trade-offs. Like, are you, when you look at the kind of human impact side of things, is there like a small impact that you're willing to accept for a large gain is actually maybe a common question that's going to end up being asked around AI and ethics as a whole. And I don't feel equipped as a person to answer those questions. I think the best we can do, at least, or the best that we as a group could do with this, was be able to put that question in front of a leader with the right sort of framing, and then have them make that decision accordingly, right? And that's, you know, because I mean, you know, honestly, like, ethics and morality is like certainly a weird thing in the data science landscape, but when you add the political mix into it, it becomes a whole other nightmarish kind of problem. And we definitely did not want to get in the middle of like, we think X things are good and X things are bad, and so therefore the toolkit should craft in that direction. That was not a space that we wanted to go into.
Okay, so I think we are at time. We are, thank you very, very much for your presentation. And as a reminder, our next event will be in September, and we'll be presenting the results of our government analytics survey, which again, you might have received a link for. If not, we will send it out again. And so we look forward to seeing you in September. Thank you.